Chapter 2 of The Pupil. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. The Pupil by Henry James. Chapter 2. On the Friday he saw them all, as Mrs. Moreen had promised, for her husband had come back and the girls and the other son were at home. Mr. Moreen had a white moustache, a confiding manner, and in his buttonhole the ribbon of a foreign order, bestowed, as Pemberton eventually learned, for services. For what services he never clearly ascertained. This was a point, one of a large number, that Mr. Moreen's manner never confided. What it emphatically did confide was that he was even more a man of the world than you might at first make out. Ulick, the firstborn, was in visible training for the same profession, under the disadvantage as yet, however, of a buttonhole but feebly floral, and a moustache with no pretensions to type. The girls had hair and figures and manners and small fat feet, but had never been out alone. As for Mrs. Moreen, Pemberton saw on a nearer view that her elegance was intermittent, and her parts didn't always match. Her husband, as she had promised, met with enthusiasm Pemberton's ideas in regard to a salary. The young man had endeavoured to keep these stammerings modest, and Mr. Moreen made it no secret that he found them wanting in style. He further mentioned that he aspired to be intimate with his children, to be their best friend, and that he was always looking out for them. That was what he went off for, to London and other places, to look out. And this vigilance was the theory of life as well as the real occupation of the whole family. They all looked out, for they were very frank on the subject of its being necessary. They desired it to be understood that they were earnest people, and also that their fortune, though quite adequate for earnest people, required the most careful administration. Mr. Moreen, as the parent bird, sought sustenance for the nest. Ulick invoked support mainly at the club, where Pemberton guessed that it was usually served on green cloth. The girls used to do up their hair and their frocks themselves, and our young man felt appealed to be glad in regard to Morgan's education, that though it must naturally be of the best, it didn't cost too much. After a little he was glad, forgetting at times his own needs in the interest inspired by the child's character and culture and the pleasure of making easy terms for him. During the first weeks of their acquaintance, Morgan had been as puzzling as a page in an unknown language, altogether different from the obvious little Anglo-Saxons who had misrepresented childhood to Pemberton. Indeed, the whole mystic volume in which the boy had been amateurishly bound demanded some practice in translation. Today, after a considerable interval, there is something phantasmagoria, like a prismatic reflection or a serial novel, in Pemberton's memory of the queerness of the Moreens. If it were not for a few tangible tokens, a lock of Morgan's hair cut by his own hand, and the half-dozen letters received from him when they were disjoined, the whole episode and the figures peopling it would seem too inconsequent for anything but dreamland. Their supreme quaintness was their success, as it appeared to him for a while at the time, since he had never seen a family so brilliantly equipped for failure. Wasn't it success to have kept him so hatefully long? Wasn't it success to have drawn him in that first morning at déjeuner, the Friday he came? It was enough to make one superstitious, so that he utterly committed himself, and this not by calculation or on a signal, but from a happy instinct which made them, like a band of gypsies, work so neatly together. They amused him as much as if they really had been a band of gypsies. He was still young and had not seen much of the world. His English years had been properly arid, and therefore the reversed conventions of the Moreens, for they had their desperate proprieties, struck him as topsy-turvy. He had encountered nothing like them at Oxford. Still less had any such note been struck to his younger American ear during the 4 years at Yale, in which he had richly supposed himself to be reacting against a Puritan strain. The reaction of the Moreens, at any rate, went ever so much further. He had thought himself very sharp that first day in hitting them all off in his mind with the cosmopolite label. Later it seemed feeble and colourless, confessedly helplessly provisional. He yet, when he first applied it, felt a glow of joy. For an instructor he was still empirical. Rise from the apprehension that living with them would really be to see life. Their sociable strangeness was an intimation of that, their chatter of tongues, their gaiety and good humour, their infinite dawdling. They were always getting themselves up, but it took forever, and Pemberton had once found Mr. Moreen shaving in the drawing-room. Their French, their Italian, and cropping up in the foreign fluencies, their cold, tough slices of American. They lived on macaroni and coffee. They had these articles prepared in perfection, but they knew recipes for 100 other dishes. They overflowed with music and song, were always humming and catching each other up, and had a sort of professional acquaintance with continental cities. They talked of "good places" as if they had been pickpockets or strolling players. They had at Nice a villa, a carriage, a piano and a banjo, and they went to official parties. They were a perfect calendar of the days of their friends, which Pemberton knew them, when they were indisposed, to get out of bed to go to, and which made the week larger than life when Mrs. Moreen talked of them with Paula and Amy. Their initiations gave their new friend at first an almost dazzling sense of culture. Mrs. Moreen had translated something at some former period, an author whom it made Pemberton feel borné never to have heard of. They could imitate Venetian and sing Neapolitan, and when they wanted to say something very particular, communicated with each other in an ingenious dialect of their own, an elastic spoken cipher, which Pemberton at first took for some patois of one of their countries, but which he caught on to as he would not have grasped provincial development of Spanish or German. "It's the family language, ultramourine," Morgan explained to him drolly enough, but the boy rarely condescended to use it himself, though he dealt in colloquial Latin as if he had been a little prelate. Among all the days with which Mrs. Moreen's memory was taxed, she managed to squeeze in one of her own which her friends sometimes forgot. But the house drew a frequented air from the number of fine people who were freely named there, and from several mysterious men with foreign titles and English clothes, whom Morgan called the princes, and who, on sofas with the girls, talked French very loud, though sometimes with some oddity of accent, as if to show they were saying nothing improper. Pemberton wondered how the princes could ever propose in that tone and so publicly. He took it for granted cynically that this was what was desired of them. Then he recognized that even for the chance of such an advantage Mrs. Moreen would never allow Paula and Amy to receive alone. These young ladies were not at all timid, but it was just the safeguards that made them so candidly free. It was a houseful of bohemians who wanted tremendously to be Philistines. In one respect, however, certainly they achieved no rigour. They were wonderfully amiable and ecstatic about Morgan. It was a genuine tenderness, an artless admiration, equally strong in each. They even praised his beauty, which was small, and were as afraid of him as if they felt him of finer clay. They spoke of him as a little angel and a prodigy. They touched on his want of health with long, vague faces. Pemberton feared at first an extravagance that might make him hate the boy, but before this happened he had become extravagant himself. Later, when he had grown rather to hate the others, it was a bribe to patience for him that they were at any rate nice about Morgan, going on tiptoe if they fancied he was showing symptoms, and even giving up somebody's day to procure him a pleasure. Mixed with this too was the oddest wish to make him independent, as if they had felt themselves not good enough for him. They passed him over to the new members of their circle, very much as if wishing to force some charity of adoption on so free an agent, and get rid of their own charge. They were delighted when they saw Morgan take so to his kind playfellow, and could think of no higher praise for the young man. It was strange how they contrived to reconcile the appearance, and indeed the essential fact, of adoring the child with their eagerness to wash their hands of him. Did they want to get rid of him before he should find them out? Pemberton was finding them out month by month. The boy's fond family, however this might be, turned their backs with exaggerated delicacy as if to avoid the reproach of interfering. Seeing in time how little he had in common with them, it was by them he first observed it, they proclaimed it with complete humility. His companion was moved to speculate on the mysteries of transmission, the far jumps of heredity. Where his detachment from most of the things they represented had come from was more than an observer could say. It certainly had burrowed under 2 or 3 generations. As for Pemberton's own estimate of his pupil, it was a good while before he got the point of view, so little had he been prepared for it by the smug young barbarians to whom the tradition of tutorship, as hitherto revealed to him, had been adjusted. Morgan was scrappy and surprising, deficient in many properties supposed common to the genus, and abounding in others that were the portion only of the supernaturally clever. One day his friend made a great stride. It cleared up the question to perceive that Morgan was supernaturally clever, and that though the formula was temporarily meagre, this would be the only assumption on which one could successfully deal with him. He had the general quality of a child for whom life had not been simplified by school, a kind of home-bred sensibility which might have been as bad for himself, but was charming for others, and a whole range of refinement and perception, little musical vibrations as taking as picked-up airs, begotten by wandering about Europe at the tail of his migratory tribe. This might not have been an education to recommend in advance, but its results with so special a subject were as appreciable as the marks on a piece of fine porcelain. There was at the same time in him a small strain of stoicism, doubtless the fruit of having had to begin early to bear pain, which counted for pluck and made it of less consequence than he might have been thought at school rather than a polyglot little beast. Pemberton indeed quickly found himself rejoicing that school was out of the question. In any million of boys it was probably good for all but one, and Morgan was that millionth. It would have made him comparative and superior, it might have made him really require kicking. Pemberton would try to be school himself, a bigger seminary than 500 grazing donkeys, so that winning no prizes the boy would remain unconscious and irresponsible and amusing because though life was already intense in his childish nature, freshness still made there a strong draught for jokes. It turned out that even in the still air of Morgan's various disabilities, jokes flourished greatly. He was a pale, lean, acute, undeveloped little cosmopolite who liked intellectual gymnastics, and who also, as regards the behavior of mankind, had noticed more things than you might suppose, but who nevertheless had had his proper playroom of superstitions, where he smashed a dozen toys a day. End of Chapter 2.